What's up, 11th grade? I wanted to take a few minutes to just provide some clarification and kind of walk through the assignment for this week. I also wanted to remind you guys there isn't any penalty for turning things in late. So even though this assignment is due on Friday, if you turned it in on Saturday or Sunday or Monday, it's helpful for me for you to shoot me an email just to tell me you turned it in late so I know to look for it. But don't panic if you don't have stuff done on time. You just want to try to do your best to stay on top of things. So I'm going to show you a few things here. So first, I'm going to have my screen share up. So what I've got in front of you here is the Renaissance Remote Learning course offerings. This is where you get all of your assignments on the Springfield Renaissance School website. As you scroll down, you see your internship link. You've got a bunch of other information, guidance, etc. And then you get down into your core classes. Below that, you have your humanities assignments, guidance work, and then assignments from previous weeks. If you saw my other video today, I reminded folks that assignments, you need to complete 60%. So you need to complete at least 6 out of the 10 assignments from 4-6 through the end of the year. So I wanted to give folks a little, and that video is right here, wanted to give folks a little primer on how to do this assignment. I know there's a few of you who haven't done any of them. A lot of these are using the same document to support. So this week, there's the video, and then you scroll down to CP for college prep. This week's work is based on Black militancy and the roots of the Black Power movement, Eyes on the Prize, Part 7, overview, questions, and documents. So whereas in previous weeks, you guys have had to watch videos, this week you really just have to focus on the documents. So you want to read the introduction to each of the 5 documents after you go through the overview and timeline, and choose the one that interests you the most. And then you want to read one document and respond to all questions in one typed page, upload to Unified Classroom. So I'm going to take a few minutes now to sort of walk through how that might look. So I see here it says read overview and timeline. So I'm going to click the document, open that up in a new tab. And here's the document. So it looks exactly the same as the previous ones. It's based on episode 7, but again, you didn't have to watch the episode. You just needed to read through this. So episode 7 is the first installment of the original Eyes on the Prize 2, America at a Racial Crossroads. The 8 episodes in Eyes on the Prize examine challenges activists faced as they work to translate legal and legislative victories in the 1950s and early 1960s to social and economic policies and assume greater control over their lives. Those efforts would expand the reach of American democracy and inspire other minorities to fight for recognition and influence. Despite their legal and constitutional successes, Black Americans still were subjected to discrimination and terror as they attempted to live out their constitutionally guaranteed rights. Frustration with the slow pace of change, perceived indifference to their cause, so feeling like people didn't care, would lead some Black Americans to question many of the key assumptions of the Southern freedom movement, including the need for integration with the white community and the role of nonviolence in the freedom struggle. So basically some people are starting to question, do we need to integrate? And also, is nonviolence the right way? So those groups start these new organizations. So Black militancy and the roots of the Black Power movement. This episode also tracks the influence of ideas as Black separatism. So there were some people, there was like a Go Back to Africa movement where African Americans in the US said, the US isn't for us, we should leave. And Black nationalism on a new generation of Black Americans, and analyzes the long-term impact they had on whites who supported the freedom movement. So one of the things that did happen was some of the white participants of the civil rights movement started to feel maybe targeted by these more Black-centric groups. So the first segment explores Malcolm X and describes how his views challenge the nonviolent tradition of the civil rights movement. Born Malcolm Little in 1925 in Omaha, Nebraska, he grew up in Michigan, Boston, and New York. As a young adult, Little became involved in a life of crime and violence for which he was jailed for several years. While in prison, he joined the Nation of Islam and changed his name to Malcolm X. Under the leadership of Elijah Muhammad, the Nation of Islam made inroads into Black communities in the urban North by advocating a program of self-help, Black separatism, and Black nationalism. In the 1950s, the Nation of Islam grew in popularity in these communities and began to challenge long-held beliefs of integration and reconciliation. So what that's saying is that a lot of these new, more militant organizations are not saying, we want to all live together in harmony. They're questioning, maybe we shouldn't integrate. Maybe we should stay separate, take care of our own business, and not try to integrate into white communities. And maybe we're not wanting to live with them because we're not willing to forgive and forget, slavery and Jim Crow, etc. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. The second half of the episode describes Malcolm X's influence on members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee called SNCC. Black nationalism and militancy of Malcolm X appealed to SNCC, many of whom had been beaten and terrorized by segregationists. So we start to see some people who were on the nonviolent side starting to move over to the more militant side of things. I'm going to jump ahead here just a little bit. They talk about Stokely Carmichael taking over as the front man of SNCC after John Lewis, and how Carmichael, he had sort of a more militant vision of Black nationalism and sort of changed that organization. And then we'll jump down here. The key questions this week were not one of the things that you had to focus on. I did ask you to also look at the timeline. So we see Malcolm X's birth. We see in 1959, there was a TV program on Nation of Islam and Malcolm X that kind of introduced these more militant organizations to mainstream America. 1964, we see Malcolm X severing his ties with Nation of Islam and converts to a different type of Islam, and he publicizes the organization of pro-Afro-American unity to promote the Black nationalism and human rights. In 1965, he's assassinated. We see in 1966, this continues with James Meredith being shot. And the SCLC, so the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and SNCC, headed by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Stokely Carmichael, lead thousands in a protest designed to complete Meredith's march. So that's sort of the introduction. The second part that I had asked for you to do was to read a few of the introductions of these documents. I will start, I guess I can start with the first one. If you opted to do the first one, what I would do is I would skim to the end first and look at what the connections are. So these are the connections questions that we're talking about. If in your ed plan you have extended time, you can do 2 instead of 4 of these, but it's always smart to read through the questions before you read the document. So compare the way Bayard Rustin and Malcolm X view the impediments, so that's things that stood in the way, to Black freedom and equality. What led each man to form his particular view? How did their different views influence the strategies they used and their willingness to work within the system? And what do you think America would look like had each accomplished their goals? So this one is kind of a compare and contrast between those two men. Number 2, how did Malcolm X characterize the nonviolent movement? Do you agree with his assessment that the movement was passive? Question 3, why did Malcolm X believe that separation was the only solution to racial discrimination in the US? Compare what Malcolm X and Rustin viewed, how they viewed white people. Compare the way that Malcolm X and Rustin viewed white people. Who were these people in each man's eyes? And then 4, what questions would you ask Rustin and Malcolm X? Any of these are good to answer. I think 1 and 3 could kind of be combined. So I might look at those since they're both comparing Malcolm X and Bayard Rustin. So now that I've got that, okay, a thing that I'm going to notice is there's an introduction to this document, and then there's a document itself. The document is an interview, um, where Bayard Rustin, who some of you may have researched earlier in this target, he is interviewing Malcolm X, and they're kind of going back and forth with their own views. So what I would do is, as I'm filling this out, you could make maybe like a little T-chart in your notebook or in a document, and then put X Rustin and jot your notes down that way. And then once you have that organizer put together, you should be able to answer those questions pretty well. Again, once you do complete the assignment, you can upload that to PowerSchool. And again, if it is late, it's not a huge deal. If you need a few extra days, you have a few extra days. Like I said in the other video, please make sure that you guys are completing 6 out of 10 at a minimum in order to get credit for fourth quarter. 6 out of 10 in normal circumstances is pretty close to failing. Okay, so they did set the bar relatively low. We know that this is a hard time for everybody. So I would encourage you to please do your best to complete these assignments. If you're working on a past assignment and you're a student with an ed plan, same deal. You can answer half the questions. I would rather have 2 well answered questions than 4 questions that are rushed. All right. I miss you guys a lot. Good luck on your work, and please, please, please email me or send me a message on Remind. I'm happy to help. And I hope you guys have a great rest of your week and a good weekend.